Good morning, sixth graders. What you should have out in front of you is this set of notes that you've gotten from me or from the front table. It's the evolution and natural selection notes. This will be your number 5 in your table of contents. So this video and these notes will take us through the next phase of evolution and natural selection. Hopefully by now you've probably played the peppered moth simulation where we were pretending to be birds, hunting the moths in both the light forest and the dark forest, which, as from your RAD as well as from this game, we learned that the forest became darker due to pollution, right? Due to the Industrial Revolution, polluting with coal, the trees basically got all sooty and covered in dark soot. And so the birds were more able or better able to hunt different colored moths in different forests. And what we saw was the population, the overall makeup of the moth population change over time based on how well individuals could hide and blend in and avoid being eaten from the birds or by the birds. And so we see that evolution happens by what we call as natural selection. And it's not because the moths wanted to blend in or needed to blend in, but it's because some moths were born with the wing color that allowed them to blend in and others didn't. So based on what color wings they had, they either survived or they didn't. So that's why we say that evolution is the process of populations, not just an organism changing, because organisms can't really change. An organism cannot evolve or adapt. We're not going to use the word adapt as a verb. We're going to use it as a noun, adaptation. So populations, meaning groups of organisms, can change over time. And the way that that happens is, like we saw with the peppered moths, is through natural selection. So if we're looking at this picture, I want you to stop and think for a second about what is wrong with this image here. So we notice that in this theory, this is Lamarckian natural or Lamarckian evolution. We start with a short-necked giraffe that continues to stretch and stretch and stretch its neck. And over time, that giraffe can make its neck longer and therefore would pass on the genes that it has of its long neck. If you, no matter how hard you want to be able to play basketball and dunk, if you're my height, that's just not going to happen. And no matter what stretching you do, you will never be tall enough to dunk. And so, if you're short like me. So no matter how much I stretch, it's just not going to work, right? And so I can't pass on tall genes if I don't have them. So this is Lamarckian evolution, and this is wrong because organisms can't want or need to change. It happens over time to a group of organisms based on what's already in that gene pool. So I'm going to just go full screen here. Natural selection is looking at how an organism with a positive variation, also known as an adaptation, will survive and increase in frequency, number. So if these moths here, the white-colored moths, are able to blend in, that means that they have an adaptation. Their light color is an adaptation. Over here in this environment, that light color is no longer an adaptation. It's still a variation, but it's a negative variation. It's one that's going to get them killed more often, and therefore they will actually decrease in frequency or number. So this is kind of a sad picture here, but going back to those giraffes, the way that it works here is that we've got these short giraffes and they don't have a positive variation. They don't have an adaptation. They are too short to reach the vegetation, whereas this tall one can easily reach the vegetation. So that tall one will be able to pass on its genes by mating and reproduction, but these shorter ones will not be as successful. And while they might be able to survive for a little while, or they might be able to help each other, stand on each other's backs maybe, I don't know if giraffes do that, over time they're going to be less successful and more prone to dying. Variation is any difference between a single trait among organisms. It can be a positive one, meaning help survival. It can be negative, meaning it decreases their chances of survival, or in many cases, it could just be neutral. So when we're thinking about these dogs here, they can vary in a ton of different ways. We see that their fur color is all different. Their ear shape could potentially be different, with ears sticking up or ears flopping down. Their tail length or type, right? Is it a fluffy tail, a curly tail? Is it a kind of a narrow tail? what's their paw size like, right? So different variations, we can pick out variations in any populations, and some of those can help them survive. Those would be called adaptations. Some of them don't really matter, right? Like dogs aren't going to, at least our dogs in our homes are no longer going to survive better based on their fur color, right? Because they're not blending in to hunt or to avoid being hunted. So that would be a neutral one. A negative variation would be like if one was born with some kind of heart condition or something like that, right? That was genetic and passed on. Those kinds of things that are passed on and decrease your chance of surviving would be a negative variation. So it's only called an adaptation if it helps, if it is a positive variation that helps survival, right? So these two over here have negative variations, right? That do not, they actually hurt their chance of survival. Whereas this guy with the long neck, he's got a greater chance of survival. Therefore, the long neck trait, the long neck variation is the adaptation. Short, even a medium or a short neck are both negative variations. So we would not call those adaptations. We'll read more about Darwin's finches over the weekend probably. But Darwin discovered, he's kind of the guy who authored the theory of natural selection. And the way that he figured it out is he went to the Galapagos Islands. So what he saw was a huge variety of finches. And different finches lived in different parts of the islands and on different islands. And what he realized is that different finches had different beaks that were better suited for the island on which they lived. And so the finches that had kind of big, thicker beaks that were better for cracking open seeds lived on islands that had lots of seeds. The birds that had kind of sharper beaks that were better for cutting through fruit lived on islands where there were lots of fruit and less seeds. Grubs and insects, you can tell their beaks look kind of similar, right? They've got more needle nose beaks because they can reach in and pick out an insect or pick out a grub from something with that little spiky nose that they've got there, beak that they have there. And so it's not that they moved to an island and grew a different beak because they needed to eat something different. It's that a population of birds flew to an island where there were only, or the majority of the food was fruit. And the birds that had a beak randomly, just genetically, had a beak that allowed them to open up the fruit and eat the fruit, they survived better than the ones that moved there that had beaks that were better for eating grubs. Because if you live on an island where there's no grubs and there's only fruit, you better hope that you were born with the fruit beak. Because if you were born with the beak that's good for grubs, now you have a negative adaptation, one that's not going to help you open up fruits, and you'll be less likely to survive. So he found that organisms, that these finches, lived on islands and their beaks matched the food source. And that, again, is not because they wanted or needed to have a beak that matched the food source. It's because the ones that didn't have the beak that matched the food source, they had died. And the ones that did have a beak to match the food source, they were more successful. They were able to survive and pass on their genes. So we see this example here again, right, where we've got light-colored mice and we've got darker-colored mice in this kind of like dirt or gray rock being hunted by hawks. And so the tan mice are going to be more visible to the predatory birds, and so they're going to stick out. And so where we started, we actually had more tan mice. We actually see that over time, the tan mice are the ones being eaten more often, and what we end up with is a population that's almost all darker-colored mice that blend in with the background. Over time, what could actually happen is all of the tan mice get eaten because they're so easy to spot. That gene is gone from the gene pool, and the population becomes entirely gray mice that then only pass on the gray genes. And if this continued for generations over generations, the gray mice could become so different than the original mix of mice that we saw back here that they could be called their own species, right? And if later they were reintroduced to a different part of the island or a different part, where there were still this original mix of tan and gray mice, they could be so different that they would be considered their own species, possibly, right, over time. And if conversely, this had been a group of all tan mice, no gray mice existed, possibly the whole population could just go extinct, right? If that gene doesn't exist, if the gray, darker fur color doesn't exist in the population, then that population might just go extinct. So we see this happening here again as the eagles are hunting the snails, and the ones that are brighter in color get snatched a little bit more easily. It has to do with a lot of these words, which we'll come back to in a little bit. So one major reason that natural selection happens is because there's competition. There's a fight for food and resources. Those resources could be something like food. It could be something like shelter. It could be mates. It could be water or sunlight. It also could be a fight to not get eaten, right? In terms of blending in or hiding places, right? So when we're thinking about competition, it's not just for food sources, but it's also competition to avoid becoming dinner, right? When we're thinking about environmental change, it could be any change in the environment, right? It could be a fire, a big storm, a new species immigrates into a habitat. It could be the season changing from winter to spring to summer, and that brings with it different rain patterns, different heating patterns. Like I mentioned, rain. Anything that happens in the environment could be an environmental change. And this is what drives natural selection, because once the environment changes, those birch trees go from being the normal white birch trees to birch trees that are covered in soot, right? When that shift happens, nature is now selecting, it's now favoring a different color, right? Before, those white moths were able to blend in better with the trees and the lichen, but now they stuck out like a sore thumb when the trees were covered in that black soot. And so what you end up having is any environmental change, any environmental shift will then start to favor a different trait, a different variation, and the organisms with that different trait will now be favored, right? They'll be more successful. And so different variations will act as adaptations in different environments. So here, the white bunny rabbit is, out of luck. It's in a brown environment. It's a summertime. It better hope that it can go hide somewhere. But in the winter, that white rabbit has an adaptation. So depending on where they live or what time of year it is, they could have the adaptation or they could have a negative variation. And it can shift season to season, or it can shift depending on an environmental change or where they move to. So genetic variation has to be present for natural selection. And those traits have to be controlled by genes and they have to be inherited. So that's a big sentence. What that means is if there's no genetic variation, what's going to happen when an environmental change occurs is extinction, right? Going back to those mice or to the moths, if all of the moths and all of the mice are just one color and the environment shifts and there are no moths or no mice in that population that can blend in, they will all be eaten. They'll all be eaten by the birds, and that would mean the end of that population, right? That population would cease to exist potentially because none of them had a variation, none of them had a trait that allowed them to blend in. So without genetic variation, without diversity, we would see the end of species rather than a shift in species makeup, right? Rather than seeing them, seem to change color or the frequency of that color shifting, they would just go extinct. And what this second part means is traits must be controlled by genes and inherited, is we're not talking about traits, right? We can describe ourselves as somebody who's tall. That's a gene that's going to get passed on, right? I can't make myself taller or shorter. That's something that's determined by my genetics. However, I can make myself a little bit faster or a little bit stronger. But just because I work out a ton doesn't mean that my offspring will be really strong. Just because I am a runner or I'm not a runner doesn't necessarily mean that my kids will be born faster or slower, right? So some traits that we describe ourselves as are not controlled by genetics, right? Maybe the upper limits of how fast I can run is partially determined by my genes, right? My body's makeup. But I can obviously train more or train less and change that, and I can't pass that on. Same thing with your hair color, right? We all have genes that determine our hair color, but if you go and dye your hair a different color, that's not like we would be able to pass that trait on because that's not controlled by our genes. So when we're thinking about diversity, we're talking about, which is slightly different than variation, right? Variation is within fur color here, we see two different traits. We see a brown bunny and we see a white bunny. If we're looking at ears, they're all pointy, tall ears, right? So there actually wouldn't be variation in their ears. There would be variation in their fur color. So diversity is all of the combined differences. We're looking at fur color, we're looking at ears, we're looking at eye color, we're looking at general size, tail length, etc. So it's all of the combinations of all of the different variations and traits in a population, whereas variation, you're just focusing on one trait at a time. So again, to come back to diversity and why it matters in populations and in ecosystems, a population is more likely to survive environmental change if that population is diverse. An individual organism might not survive, right? In this tree, this moth might not survive, but the population as a whole, meaning all of these moths as a whole, will be more likely to make it to the next generation, the next year, if there's diversity, right? If these trees get covered in soot, while this individual moth will stick out, it's great that there's variation and diversity in the population, because that means that there are still moths that will be able to survive and pass on the traits. Without any variation, without any diversity, if all of the moths were the speckled white color and the trees turned black because of the soot, and there were no black moths, then the population would potentially end. And so we like diversity in evolution and natural selection because it's what allows it to happen. It's what allows populations to survive and not go extinct. An ecosystem is also more resilient, meaning it's tougher if there's a wide range of species. So think about it as backup. We have multiple plant species producing oxygen, right? There's many different plant species. So if something happens to one of those species, right, a disease or an insect moves in that kills one type of plant, well, there's other plants that will continue to produce oxygen in that environment. There are multiple bacterial species fixing nitrogen. So fixing nitrogen means making nitrogen usable for plants. Plants can't just take it in automatically. It needs to be like decomposed kind of in the right way. And so there's many different species of bacteria that can do that. And so if one species of bacteria disappears, it's okay. There are kind of those backup species that will also do it. There's many different bird species keeping the insects in check, right? So if one bird species were to die off or go extinct or to move away, whatever happens, there are still other birds there that wouldn't just let the insect population get out of control. And so it's almost like a system of checks and balances where you need backups in place just in case there's environmental change that wipes out or eliminates or hurts one of those species. There's other ones that do the same role. So diversity is important for evolution and natural selection at the population level, back here, right? Making sure a population can survive environmental change, but it's also important at the ecosystem level because it makes that ecosystem stronger. Consider your soccer team. Is everyone a goalie, right? That would be a bad soccer team if everybody showed up as a goalie, right? You wouldn't be able to score. Maybe the ball wouldn't go into your net, but you definitely wouldn't be able to ever score. On a football team, you don't just have a whole bunch of quarterbacks, right? And nobody to catch the ball, run the ball, or block, right? Or play defense. So you need backups and you need different players doing different things. And you have a backup quarterback in case your starter gets hurt, but you don't have 12 quarterbacks on a team, right? Because that would be silly. So when we're talking about a population, just to clarify here, a population is a group of a particular species in a specific place at a specific time. So we're talking about these penguins in this location now. In 5 years from now, that population could be totally different, right? There could be more of them, there could be less than them, or maybe they don't even live here anymore. If it's a different species, we'd be talking about a different population, right? Also living here could be a whole group of walruses or something like that. And that would be its own population, even though it's at the same time and at the same place, but it's a different species. There are other penguins that live in other places, and even though they're the same species, since they're in a different place, they'd be considered a different population. So a population is like classroom groups, right? My E-Block science group could be considered its own population, which is distinct from my G-Block. Similarly, my E block this year and my E block last year would be considered two different populations, even though they were both my E blocks and happened at the same time of day, but in 2 different years. So a species, on the other hand, is a group of similar organisms that can mate. And so what we find is, like, even though these look pretty similar and they're closely related, they're 2 different species. They come from a common ancestor, but they're 2 different species because they cannot mate and produce viable, fertile offspring with each other. A mutation is what drives variation. It's what drives the differences between all of us and all of our traits. So the fact that we have different color hair, right? We've got red hair, we've got blonde hair, we've got brown hair, we've got black hair, all the different variations within that starts with random mutations that created all the different varieties. And so most of those random changes in our body don't matter or are repaired, right? You, as your body, we talked about this earlier with cell theory and cells making copies of themselves to divide and replicate. Most variations, most random mutations that happen in your body don't matter, get deleted, or get fixed because your body's constantly copying DNA. So just like if you were copying a sentence off the board, if you messed up one letter, you'd realize it, go back and fix it. Or even if you didn't realize it, it probably wouldn't matter, right? You'd still know what the word was. Some random mutations can hurt an organism, right? If it's a random mutation that is big enough, it could actually cause that organism to have health problems or potentially die. And a tiny, tiny few are beneficial, right? A tiny few will lead to that organism being better off because of that mutation. And that mutation, those tiny few, are the ones that drive the variations, that drive adaptations and natural selection. Because without those tiny mutations that make an organism slightly different than the rest of the organisms in its population, it wouldn't be an organism that has a trait that allows it to survive and therefore be called an adaptation, right? So we like, in general, mutations are what drive evolution. If we're thinking back to, like, how do species split off from one another? Well, it's because of genetic differences. And the way that genetic differences start are mutations in your DNA. Most of them, though, don't matter or are repaired on the spot. That's why we don't have a billion different human species, right? Another key part of natural selection and evolution is the idea of overproduction, right? That organisms of a species often produce far more offspring than can survive. So fish, for instance, they lay thousands and thousands and thousands of eggs. Only a few are going to live. Many of them die because they're eaten at prey or for whatever various reasons. And so possibly it's just random, right? Which ones get eaten and which ones don't. Could be random. But another possibility is that the ones that lived were different in some way. They were different because they blended in, because they were faster, because they had some adaptation that allowed them to avoid being eaten. And if it's not random, right, if the death, the living and the dying is not random, but it's due to an adaptation, it's due to a slight difference, that would then push natural selection and evolution in the direction of that adaptation, that trait. So if it's because this group of 5 were able to blend in better because they had slightly different scales, then the next generation will look more like these ones. And the next generation, right? And so that would be how evolution and speciation, meaning creating different species, would occur. So we just to kind of touch back on our last topic, which was evidence of evolution, right? There's fossils in the fossil record, which help us piece together evolution. There's comparative anatomy, which allows us to compare the bone structure and anatomical structures of living and non-living, right, fossilized organisms, to compare and see, put together that fossil record and put together how organisms are related and how they evolved. Same thing with embryology, where we can compare just how closely related organisms are based on what they look like and their structures as embryos. There's the idea of biogeography and Pangea, and that the fact that there are organisms that are related and look alike spread all over the globe tells us that at one point in time, Pangea, right, all the continents were formed into Pangea, and their distribution also tells us about when they evolved. Did they evolve before the breakup of Pangea, and therefore they're found everywhere, or did they evolve after Pangea broke up, and then they're only found in one limited location, right? Cell theory, the idea that all organisms come from a single cell and that all life started as a single cell. Another piece of evidence that supports that everything at one point or another branched off and was related. And finally, DNA comparison obviously makes it much easier, because if we can compare the DNA, then we're not just comparing bones or fossils, which can be misleading, right? Things can look alike but not be actually related, right? They'd be analogous. But the DNA is kind of the best evidence that we have, because we can truly compare just how related organisms are based on the percentage matchup of those genes. So we've got a lot of evidence, right? And especially with DNA, we've got some really, really great evidence that evolution happens. But this slideshow then kind of took us through how evolution happens, right? And we don't want to talk about evolution happening because an organism adapts. I don't even like talking about a population adapting. I would rather talk about a group having an adaptation, right? So rather than saying that the giraffes adapted to their environment, I would rather frame it as some of the giraffes had an adaptation that allowed them to reach the leaves, and therefore they were better able to survive and therefore find a mate and reproduce. Those that did not have long necks did not have the adaptation. They had a variation that actually decreased their chance of survival. Their variation was short or medium-sized necks, and those were not positive, right? Those were negative variations. They decreased their chances of survival. So let's try not to use the word adapt or adapting or adapted, right? Let's stick with adaptation, because when we use it as a verb, it leads us to talk about it in a way where we think about an organism or a population changing in the moment, right? Trying to change or wanting or needing to change, or that, if that organism really tries, it can grow a longer neck. And we don't want to think about it like that, because we know that's not true, right? Mr. Kalman's never going to be able to dunk a basketball. And so instead, you are either born with the adaptation or you're not, right? You're the giraffe that's born with a long neck, or unfortunately, you're not. Let's think about it